Hello, everyone. Welcome, and thank you so much for joining us tonight for the launch for the just out new novel by Mike Chen, Light Years from Home. We're in for a treat tonight. He is in conversation with Booksmith BFF, Annalee Newitz. My name is Evan Karp, and I'm the events manager for Booksmith. We're an independent bookstore and mainstay of San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury district since 1976. Without further ado, I am so happy to introduce tonight's stars. Annalee Newitz writes science fiction and nonfiction. They are the author of the book Four Lost Cities, A Secret History of the Urban Age, and the novels The Future of Another Timeline and Autonomous, which won the Lambda Literary Award. As a science journalist, they are a writer for the New York Times and elsewhere, and have a monthly column in New Scientist. They have published in the Washington Post, Slate, Popular Science, Ars Technica, The New Yorker, and The Atlantic, among others. They're the co-host of the Hugo Award-winning podcast, Our Opinions Are Correct. Previously, they were the founder of IO9 and served as the editor-in-chief of Gizmodo. And Mike Chen is the author of the award-nominated Here and Now and Then, and featured in Star Wars From a Certain Point of View, The Empire Strikes Back. He has covered geek culture for sites such as Tor.com, The Mary Sue, and StarTrek.com, and used to cover the NHL for Fox Sport and other outlets. A member of SFWA, Mike lives in the Bay Area with his wife, daughter, and rescue animals, and we are delighted to be here and celebrate the new book with you, Mike, tonight. Congratulations, and Annalee, it's always a pleasure. Thank you for leading the conversation.
Thanks so much.
Thank you,
yeah, we hope that you will buy lots of books at Booksmith. First, you're going to buy all of Mike's books, and then you're going to buy all their other books. That's the plan for tonight. And also, yay, it's nice to see you, Mike.
I know, we've been trying to see each other in person. The pandemic keeps getting in the way. And we're supposed to be at San Francisco Writers Conference, which was originally going to be in a few weeks. And then the pandemic booted that to July too. So
yeah, so eventually we'll be in the same physical location, but for now, these holograms will be fine.
It's karma, because we kicked off the pandemic 2 years ago doing a launch for my pandemic book, A Beginning at the End. So I wrote a pandemic book, and then the pandemic happened and we talked about it, and now everything is screwed.
I know. So tonight we're just going to try to mess something else up related to alien invasion, I guess, or it's just more alien abduction.
Aliens
were
in the news today.
Oh yeah. So we're kicking it off again.
Yes.
And I should just say congrats on this book, which is amazing. I loved it so much. And I was saying to Mike before we started, like, this book is such a page turner. Like, it really is gonna, just warning you that if you start the book tonight, you will not go to sleep. You'll just be turning the pages really fast. It's just, and it's so moving, and it has lots of your usual amazing emotional resonance that you have in all of your work. And so I'm just gonna start asking you questions about it. Mm-hmm. So this is a book about alien abduction, which is a pretty well-known trope in science fiction. You know, we've seen lots of alien abduction before. And I'm wondering how you tackled that when you first decided you were going to write about it. Did you want to pull from certain tropes? Did you want to avoid some? Like, what were kind of the barriers and signposts for you?
So it's a little bit of both, and I'll go back to like where the origin of this book is actually, and we were just talking about indie rock before we came on. It's an indie rock song from the 90s. It's called Red. It's by a band called Belly. The singer-songwriter Tanya Donnelly just writes amazing lyrics, and so that song, I remember reading a press clipping back in '95 when I was, much younger and much cooler. And she had talked about how it was about someone who wished for alien abduction as like an escape from their situation. And that was such a twist to me, because it's like, usually it's something to be totally feared. And she was trying to write a story of, someone who wished for it and then it happened. And I thought, oh, that's really, really interesting. And it stuck with me for a really long time. And I tried to write a short story based on that a few years ago, and that went nowhere. It was terrible, but I still have it in my Google Drive. So when I was looking at this book, the biggest trope, I think, was to avoid, well, I wanted to take that twist. of like, it's wish fulfillment, and then the fallout from that wish fulfillment. So the biggest trope that I wanted to avoid, like, really kind of came from like the structure of the book, because so many of these stories are about the abductee's experience or like the immediate like obsessive search afterward. But in this case, following Jacob's abduction, so I let that trope go to his dad, Arnold, who we see kind of like in the periphery and in flashbacks. But I'm much more interested. I mean, you've read all my books, so you probably know. I'm interested in the human impact when you take these tropes from any sort of sci-fi subgenre and ground them in reality. So here, there's a lot of ripple effect, both in like the practical and emotional fallout of how this fundamentally changes the trajectory of the family. So like I embraced the tropes, but then I also kind of stepped away from them to use kind of like a framing that we don't usually get in alien abduction stories.
Yeah, because it's very, in some ways it's kind of a mundane story. It's like, what happens to a family when someone disappears and you don't know why, and how do people kind of cope with that? But it's also kind of intercut, like the way that the novel opens. This is not a spoiler since this is literally the opening of the novel. It opens like in the middle of like a giant starship battle, and there's aliens and there's like fire, like all this stuff is happening. Aliens with peculiarly human names. And, so we're kind of jumping from that kind of world into this very quiet world. And I wanted to remind you, Mike, that when you were initially writing this book, you emailed me and you were like, this is a couple years ago, and you were like, so like, basically boiling it down, like you asked very eloquently, how weird can I make the aliens? How weird can I make the spaceships? And I was like, go for it. Like, make spaceships out of fabric, make aliens out of goo, like. And because that's me, I'm always like, go for the weirdest thing. And then what did you do with that advice, Mike? Tell us about your aliens.
So I asked Annalee, because Annalee is the smartest person I know. And every time I hear from Annalee or watch Annalee talk, I feel smarter about science. So I asked, like, if aliens really existed, which I think statistically, seems extremely likely.
Yeah, sure.
Would they be humanoid? Would their ships be made out of metal? Everything we see in movies and stuff. And the thing I remember most from that conversation is that you pointed out that the aliens and their tech and their manufacturing would be dependent on the environment that they evolved in.
Yeah.
So I think I even asked, like, does it make sense if they're bipedal? Because I mean, like, obviously Hollywood casts bipedal. Well, I mean, even now, like with CG, like you have people doing mocap, but they're still like bipedal designs. And I remember you said it makes sense if they're in, as we would say in Star Trek, a Class M planet, where they have to navigate around, when they have to like climb things, like if there's terrain. That makes sense for bipedal and symmetrical, because that's really efficient in terms of movement. But then if you look like deep in our ocean, everything's completely different. And so I thought, like, okay, how do I bring this into what I want to write about, but also consider the fact that I generally hate world building and I find it to be extremely difficult. So a good example of like the non-humanoid aliens is if anyone, hopefully people have read Project Hail Mary by Andy Weir. It's a delightful book. And there's not really a spoiler, but there's like alien life that is not standard. And I thought, oh, that was really creative.
Yeah.
And then also, like in Star Trek Prodigy, there's a character named Zero who is non-corporeal, but travels along in like this little floating mech. So it's like, it's cool to see that sort of thing. I'm not that creative with my aliens. First, like the ships and the technology. So you also said it would be based on their environment, what they have access to, like, and what they can convert into like manufacturing and energy and things like that. Yeah. So I thought for this, instead of metal, because metal is used everywhere in sci-fi, I decided to use a mineral. So it's a mineral based structure that they build out of, and like they mine it, they harvest it by crystallizing like their enemies after they steal their technology, and they basically turn them into fodder for building stuff. So it's not cool.
Yeah. It's
But
very creepy and awesome.
yeah, so it's like you could be looking at, like, if you're theoretically in your spaceship, you could be looking at their wall, and their wall could be like, the remains of, your buddy who was just turned into crystal. So I wanted to get that kind of like horror vibe, but I wanted there to be like a through logic for it, and it not just to be like industrial metal that is on a Hollywood set. But for the aliens themselves, I decided that the world building would be too hard for me to do. So instead,
fair enough. Like,
well, the idea is, the story is like driven by space opera, but it's really only like 10% space opera. It's like at the very beginning and some flashbacks, and it's intercut in between. But I kicked it off with the space opera bit because talking with my editor, I was like, this is the only place it fits. If you put it in the middle of all the family stuff, it's going to be way too jarring. But if we put it as kind of a prologue to establish like these are the stakes going in, that's where we put it there. But then when you actually see the aliens themselves, if you are a Mass Effect fan or Star Trek Discovery fan or the Clone Wars fan, if you read the descriptions carefully, I'm just saying that some of my favorite aliens made cameos in there because I didn't want to create new species. That's too hard.
Yeah, I love that though. And I think it does come across as alien. And I want to push back on what you were saying about how you don't like doing world building, because I think that you do incredible world building, but it's these small domestic worlds that you build, these families that we really care about and that feel so believable and like flawed, but also, full of hope and desires that are so relatable. So I wanted to talk about how this is a novel. And again, this isn't a spoiler. This is a novel that's really about loss and processing that loss. The family has lost one of the kids, who we know has been abducted by aliens, but the family doesn't know that. And the kid's been gone for a long time. Jacob has been gone for years when the novel starts. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that, about building that family and those relationships and how it's sort of built around processing long-term loss.
So this kind of goes with like the flow chart of inspiration I had for this book. So it started off with that short story, and essentially like the character in the short story in the song is kind of like Jacob, like someone who like wants something different and wishes to go away and then gets that. But then from there, the biggest spark of inspiration was the Netflix series, The Haunting of Hill House. And because I remember watching that and like immediately halfway through, I was like, I wish I could write something like this, because it's so focused on character. It takes what would typically be, a pretty common horror trope of like, the house is evil and it's haunting this family. But it really looks at like, if you made that a single traumatic event and then you caught up with the family, 15, 20 years later, and just see how that really messed them up and really pushed them in different directions. And there's death, and there's like, how do you cope with the death? And was it real and was it not? And who believes what? And so I thought like, I really wish I could write something like that. So then when I was thinking about that, then to me, it was like, oh, well, I kind of had an idea already. And we were in the middle of an X-Files rewatch at the time. So then it was like, the structure and stakes of Hill House, and then the inspiration of that story about Red, and then like the tone of X-Files about like, the aliens are always a little bit out of view. It's really focusing on like what is the mystery involving with them, and it ultimately came down to like, I wanted it to be like an X-Files episode where Mulder and Scully didn't visit. It was really about like the family in there, but it was very much like similar in tone. Anytime I needed an inspiration to return in tone, I just went back to X-Files.
That's so interesting, because twice now you've talked about horror inspirations for this book, which is a very solidly sci-fi book. I mean, the ships are built out of bones. I hadn't quite thought about that before. It's like really super creepy, Mike. And I'm wondering, like, when I think about alien abductions and families, I always think about that scene from Close Encounters where the little kid is being abducted, and it's like, probably one of the scariest things I ever saw when I was a kid.
Yeah.
And I'm sure it scared a lot of parents too. And I'm wondering, why do you think that family trauma and alien abduction go so well together? Like, what is it about this particular kind of story that just really lets us go there?
I think it's fear of the unknown. Fear of, like, because I mean, when you're little, you're always being warned about, like, don't talk to strangers because they could be like kidnappers and stuff.
Right.
As a parent, your big fear is always, losing your child. So you have that kind of painted on top of like fear of like the unknown. So I think about like the alien abduction we see in science fiction. It's usually a few different metaphors. So there's like the fear of the unknown, like that. There's fear of the other, like E.T., where it's like allegory for racism or whatever.
And yeah.
And then there's like fear of like a systemic thing, like the X-Files or They Live, that Roddy Piper movie, which is excellent.
Yeah.
But where like the aliens have taken over everyone, but they don't realize it. So so the aliens like usually kind of represent something like this. And as is the case with most of my stuff, I wanted to use like whatever the sci-fi trope was as like a metaphor for trauma and loss. So that's really where this came from, was thinking about how can you balance if someone goes away because they really wanted to, but then kind of like leaves destruction in their wake. How does that affect things? Like, how does that affect the people who don't know, and like they're not sure what to believe? And I think because we live in a very science-based age, there's something more scary about that, like aliens, as opposed to like, we know as much as we wish dragons were real, dragons are not real, but aliens are like very, very plausible. And I think like in a way where it's like, the way that they're often depicted, like there's always a tiny, tiny sliver of like, that's realistic, that could actually happen. And I think that's where like a lot of the fear comes in.
Yeah, it's true. It's different from zombies in a way too, like, because it's like zombies are the other kind of like monster that I feel like we're obsessing about right now in our science age, but like aliens feel weirdly more realistic than zombies. I'm not sure
I think
why.
because like zombies, I mean, like I remember when we did actively watch The Walking Dead, and we were like reading all like the science articles about it, and it's like this could never happen because of like flesh deterioration, because of insects eating the flesh, because of like lack of water, lack of heat that would like basically kill off the vital organs in there. It's like if zombies came to be, like they would not be able to physically exist after several weeks out in, especially out in Atlanta where they were.
Yeah,
but
it's hot,
yeah. But with aliens, it's like this technology that, like, I mean, you think about, on our phones now, we carry all the knowledge of the world. We can basically use like a video window to our friends wherever they are. We can tell it what we want and get food delivered to us. That technology would be impossible to even think about like 50 years ago. Like even in Star Trek, like the original series, like our phones are better than their computers there. So when you think about alien technology we see in shows and movies, it's like it seems impossible, but we've seen enough technological leaps where it's like, oh, that could make sense about like light speed travel or transporters or something like that.
Yeah,
but you're the smart science person. I'm just a writer. I'm just like a marketing writer by day. So what do I know?
So I just wanted to remind folks that we're going to be taking questions from the audience. So you can start asking questions now, and I'm going to ask Mike a few more questions, and then we'll turn it over to y'all. So I want to ask you about some projects you have coming up, but I have one more question about Light Years from Home, which is one of the themes in this book, and again, I don't think this is a spoiler because it's more of a theme than a plot, but a lot of the characters are dealing with some kind of like mental impairment, like either a literal impairment, there's like an alien implant, but there's also a character, the mother of the Shao family is suffering from dementia. One of the siblings thinks the other sibling is crazy. And so I wondered if you could just talk a little bit about that theme in the book. Was that something you were conscious of, or did that kind of happen as you were developing the characters?
I think if you notice in my books, there's a common theme of mental health, like examination of like psychological state and the benefits of therapy,
Yes.
which I highly believe in. Everyone should go to therapy. It's
Well,
so
yeah.
important. In this case, it was like I wanted to really examine like post-traumatic processing. Because and then like how the idea of control is really just a complete fallacy, but we all really worry about it. And like with the pandemic, I think like, God, that's been amplified so much. And like, I know it's funny because I think about like my author friends who are parents, like people are like, oh, what do authors talk about with each other? And it's just like these giant text threads of like, how are you handling pandemic stress? Did you decide to go back to school? Or it's like so much anxiety, and it's all centered around like, what can we actually control?
Yeah.
So I think like in this case, it's me going back to an idea that I did explore, ironically, in my pandemic book, a beginning at the end, the idea that trauma freezes you emotionally in a way. And so what you have here, you have characters where like everything's changing around them. So like Jacob, like he becomes like a space soldier, but he's like still kind of fundamentally who he is, whether that's healthy or not. And you have Evie who decides to become like a UFO YouTuber, but she's still like, she's trying to hold on to like her family, like the way that she knows how to, but she's having trouble moving on. And Cassie is like trying to hold on to their mom who's suffering from dementia the only way she knows how, which is just like controlling everything possible. So then you have to think about like, as people, like when we experience this trauma, how much of it is permanent, and then how much of it is like a defense mechanism. And you know, I think we're all dealing with that. And I imagine there's going to be so much, you know, books and art and music and, you know, any type of storytelling that's just going to be dealing with that, and we don't even realize. I know when I reread this book just a few weeks ago, because I had forgotten so much of it, but I had to come in and like, you know, start talking about it publicly. So I'm like, oh, I better reread it. And then I'm like, oh God, this is really about the pandemic, and I didn't even realize it. But like you see just how like it worked in there about like separation and communication and loss and things like that.
Yeah. So I know that you have another book coming out in a few months, which is a Star Wars book. Star Wars Brotherhood. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Like, I know you can't give away too much, but can you tell us about working on it and what that was like, getting sucked into the world of big IP?
There's a lot of rules around that. So I can tell you the story of how I found out about it. So it was about,
tell us whatever you can tell that, you know, you're allowed to say.
It was about May. It was like it was near the end of remote kindergarten, which is different from homeschool first grade, because remote kindergarten was actually like, we had our teachers teaching from our district remotely for like 6 hours a day, as opposed to homeschool, which is just terrible. But so my daughter was sitting with her remote teacher, and my agent called me, and I remember I picked up the phone and I said, why are you calling me? I don't have anything on sub. And then he goes, do you want to write a Star Wars novel? And I'm like, you know, my mind kind of exploded. And then my daughter is still doing school next to me, and like their microphones are on because they're talking to their teacher. So I'm like, I have to be like kind of separated from it. So he goes, it's an Anakin and Obi-Wan project. It takes place between Attack of the Clones and the Clone Wars. And like, this is, for anyone who knows me, this is my favorite era of Star Wars. So I'm like, trying not to freak out. And then I'm like asking these questions to my agent, and my wife comes down, and she's like, who are you talking to? I'm like, it's Eric. And then she hears me say it, Clone Wars. And she goes, do it. We'll figure it out. We didn't expect Delta to hit then. We didn't expect Omicron to hit, but we just made a decision that like, this is the ultimate dream project for me. So we will figure out a way to do it. So the very brief story intro that I can tell people is, it's basically what's on the back cover copy right now, which is so Anakin Skywalker has become a Jedi Knight, Obi-Wan Kenobi, and is what can I say? Okay, basically there is there is a terrorist attack on the planet Catriona, which is technically a neutral system. And so Obi-Wan is sent to be a diplomat, and Anakin is kind of on his own for the first time. And so they're trying to navigate emotionally, like where they are as former master and apprentice, but like now that they're just rushed into everything because like it's a giant war now and they don't have time to process it. So Anakin's dealing with, he's married, he's a Jedi Knight, he doesn't have a mentor anymore, and all these pressures are coming on him. And Obi-Wan is like, how do I do this without like the Padawan, who's basically been like my right hand, as much as annoying as he was, he and I were partners. And so an adventure happens that separates the two for a bit, but then of course they have to come back together. And the takeaway is it's really about them coming to terms with, even though they are on even footing, they are much better as partners and brothers rather than being separated. And it's the stuff that I really want to work in there is because like the prequel trilogy and the Clone Wars really emphasize that like that Palpatine is doing everything he can to like separate and isolate Anakin in a very much in an abuser way, because that's really how you
so
get to that.
Yeah.
So I really want to internalize within Anakin about how he's relying on these people that he trusts, and he's so much more whole as a person, which isn't really healthy, but you know, if he went to 20 years of therapy, he probably would have been okay. And Obi-Wan is trying to deal with the fact that like his Padawan is so emotional and feels so much, and that's not the Jedi way, and he doesn't know how to do that, and he doesn't know how to handle it, and he's worried like, is he good enough to handle that? So it was a lot of fun to like internally get into those characters. And then from like a craft perspective, so I had to write an outline between June and July. I had to first draft between August and November. I had to do a revision.
Wait, how many words is this book?
About 95,000.
Holy shit. Dude.
Yeah. They turned around feedback fast. And I had about 2 weeks to revise at the start of December. And then I did another short revision in January, and it should be done, assuming everyone is kosher with it. Like the synopsis that I wrote, the first one I wrote was 5 pages and expanded to 25 pages because I kept, during that 2-month process, like I kept adding more detail on, like I would put speeches in there and dialogue and descriptions, because it's like, the more I got down there, the less I would have to do later. So It was really, really intense, but it was a lot of fun. So, we would deal with kindergarten or first grade and day job, and then my daughter would go to bed, and then I would get to play in Star Wars for like 2 hours. And it was, even despite the intense word count and the deadlines, it was a lot of fun.
Yeah, I bet. And I love how, as you're describing it, it's so obviously a Mike Chen novel. You're like, It starts with a planetary trauma. And then it's all about feelings.
It is. There's a lot of feelings. It's for anyone who's read the very excellent episode 3 novelization by Matthew Stover, because it is like literary fiction and character driven in Star Wars. It's so amazing. That was like my big touch point of inspiration for it. And I got to bring some things from that into my book. So there's definitely action. There's a lightsaber fight, there's chases, and there's stuff like that, but you really, really get into the characters. And for Clone Wars fans, Asajj Ventress is in it, and she is so much fun to write because she's just a dick to everyone.
I love Ventress. I saw the flap copy and I saw that Ventress was in it, and I was like, yes.
I was surprised that they actually revealed that, because like I thought they were going to keep it a secret. She wasn't originally like in my outline, because I thought like, there's no way they would let me use her. And then I was talking with my editor, and he's like, well, what if we up the antagonist and just bring Asajj into it? I'm like, I can do that? Sure. So I can't really say too much more, except for like on a craft perspective, that it was way easier to write than my own stuff.
Yeah, because like you were saying, there's no world building. Like, I mean, there is world building, but it's like so much of it is already built. Like,
there's a lot of research on Wikipedia, but it's like when I write, like my first drafts are like these really skeletal drafts where I feel like I'm trying to discover like the voices and the world. But in this case, it's like I know exactly which, am I getting Clone Wars Anakin Skywalker or Hayden Christensen Anakin Skywalker? Like I could be the bridge between them, and it made perfect sense in my head. So it was like, I can do this easily. I'm just like writing out dialogue. I wrote a whole speech for Obi-Wan at like the pivotal Act 3 moment, and it was in the synopsis, and it's basically made it into the book like completely, just like with added descriptions in there, but like the actual dialogue is just, it's an Ewan McGregor Obi-Wan speech, and it was just so easy to write.
So you said you just would look at, you were researching on Wikipedia. Is Wikipedia like, according to like LucasArts, do they think that's like real? Like, do you know what I mean? Is that the canon for them, or is that
it's split into, so Wikipedia entries they have a canon tab and a legends tab.
Oh,
so
okay.
You have to click on the canon tab, but it was more, I didn't get too many specific details because a lot of the things like they would give me guidelines on, but it was like, I want a planet that has this characteristic. Can I find it? I want like a ship that carries this many people. Like, what was that called in Clone Wars?
Right.
So it's, instead of having to come up with it myself, it was like having a giant, resource to deal with. And that was so much nicer because I hate world building so much.
Yeah, it's a pain in the ass, I'll tell you.
Yeah.
I'm just I have a couple more questions for you, but there's one question from the audience that's immediately relevant to our conversation.
Okay. Sure.
Daniel Clark asks, how much of the Star Wars story is yours and how much was given to you by the publisher? It seems like they gave you the time period, but did they also give you like the bones of where they wanted the story to go?
It's a little bit of both. So they said like it's going to bridge Attack of the Clones and the Clone Wars, and they wanted it to. So there's the line in Revenge of the Sith where they say that business on Cato Nemoidia doesn't count. And they said like, let's play with that. So they gave me that prompt, and then I wrote my initial, I was so excited that like I had a call with the editor scheduled for the next week, and we were supposed to just like talk about ideas, but I wrote a 2-page treatment there, and like I emailed it to my agent, and he's like, I think they'll like this. And then like I read it in real time to the editor, and he's like, I think that sounds great. Can you clean it up? And I will send it to other people to see if we can go with that. So I feel like they gave me like kind of the parameters of like the sandbox I could play in and like key points to hit. And then I wrote like the bones of it. And then after that, it was like a collaborative process of like, what could I put in there?
Yeah, that's so cool. I love, they were just like, there's this one line. Can you turn that into a novel?
Yeah, that's basically
great. That's like a good prompt, actually.
Yeah. And it's a good way for IP to make money.
I mean, and like writers got to make a living too.
That's right.
So in your copious spare time between all of the other things that you're doing and creating new Star Wars content, you also have finished a new novel about vampires.
Yes.
Called Vampire Weekend that I wanted to ask you a little bit about, because I did see like a summary of Vampire Weekend, which of course, as a Mike Chen stan, I'm like immediately like, give it to me now. But the thing that really excited me or got me really interested was it's from the point of view of a vampire, right?
Yeah.
And it's so like, I was just thinking how Light Years from Home is like the opposite of that, where it's kind of like outside, like it's sort of the outside perspective on the speculative thing. And now you're going on the inside. So just tell me about that. Like, why did you decide to switch it up that way?
Because I love vampires.
Me too.
So I mean, I was the teen goth in the 90s quoting Anne Rice to everyone. So the way that this came about, I think about a year ago, maybe a year and a half ago, I saw some of my friends, like their publisher's weekly listing, like that they sold a vampire book. And so I messaged my agent. I'm like, are vampires back? Can I pitch you a vampire book? Because I was going to take a break after Light Years from Home. And he said, oh yeah, like, you can pitch something. I think there's probably a few years where we could probably sell it. And then in 2 weeks, I gave him a full proposal. And then about 2 weeks later, we sold it. And then I was like, oh no, I wrote this proposal. I don't know what to do with it. But I wanted to, this book, it's basically so much of who I was as a teen, because it's focused on, it's a vampire named Louise who uses her immortality to go see concerts and play in bands. And so she was turned in the 70s at an Iggy Pop show. And so her whole life is kind of built around this. But because like that is her focus, what she's been pushing away her whole life is like the trauma that like she kind of inherits from her family for different reasons. And she just kind of like stays away from that, and like being a musician and being a music fan and being a vampire are all like her means of escape for it, until like in the current times, so it's like circa mid 2020s, a long lost relative shows up, and he's a teenager who is very angsty, and he asks her, can she teach him guitar, and can she turn his mom, who is dying of cancer? And so she's faced with a lot of moral dilemmas, and also dealing with like, where did this kid come from? How is he connected to my past? Am I ready to face my past? And there's other stuff in there too. And there's a lot of cool punk rock references. And Annalee's band from The Future of Another Timeline, Grape Ape, they play at a very pivotal moment in the middle of the book.
Yay! Oh, they're in your timeline.
That's right.
I erased them from the timeline.
In the timeline, though, they're vampires.
Yeah, no,
too,
I mean,
so.
Changed it back. Time travelers are doing that, you know. That's definitely what my characters would do, is they try to bring them back. So
Oh, so your original question about like the monster versus
yes, let's go back to that question.
So what I really want to do with this book was like, so it kind of goes back to my whole thing of I'm taking these sci-fi tropes, but I'm trying to make them like very grounded in reality. And so for these vampires, I thought like, okay, if vampirism was a real, like basically a blood virus, and all of the tropes that we know would have to have some basis in reality. So this is not really a spoiler because it's established in the first few chapters that, so yes, they have to drink blood. Their teeth are like sharpened, but like not that sharpened, because if you think about like, that would be really, really hard to live, that like you keep cutting your mouth and stuff. Their society shuns actually attacking humans because it's like that would cause all sorts of trouble. So they have to find other ways to do it. In terms of like their internal physiology, it's like they can drink a little bit of water, like they like to drink tea from time to time, anything that you can kind of like excrete through the pores. You can mix a little bit of alcohol with the blood or a little bit of coffee with the blood. But their digestive system, their sex organs, all of those like non-essential organs are basically shut down. So like there's a character that actually tells Louise after she reveals that she's a vampire, and she explains what her life is like, and he just tells her like, that's actually really depressing, because you can't go out except at night, you can't enjoy food, you can't like, you don't really have like the hormones that like cause you to pursue like sex and relationships and things like that. And so for someone like her who's like emotionally traumatized, like it's very easy to cut yourself off even further. So it was interesting to try to find a realistic path to the monster. And there's a joke in there about like, are werewolves real? And they're like, no, that doesn't make any sense. Like, there's no way
that couldn't happen.
That couldn't physically be real. But to get in the head of the monster, and not in a dramatic Anne Rice kind of way, but something that is like, has at least 1 foot in plausible science to it. And then to deconstruct like the emotions that would come with that.
Yeah, that's so cool. I'm very on board with this book.
I just turned in the first draft, so we'll see if my editor hates it, then I'm in trouble.
That's not going to happen. Okay, I'm going to take some questions from the audience. If you have questions, there's a few queued up, but if you have some, please ask. No question is too unusual to be asked. All right, so here is a callback to earlier in our conversation. Daniel Clark asks, okay, but what if the aliens are dragons?
I guess they could just fly down and pick us up and then bring us to space then.
Yeah, I mean,
would
like
dragons need mechs? If the alien dragons were invading, could they just fly through space, or would they need some sort of power armor to protect their biology, and then they can like escape from that and just like fly around light
I
things on
mean,
fire.
first of all, dragon power armor is like my next anime obsession. Like I'd like to see that dragon power armor. But also I was thinking Dragon Riders of Pern. I mean, those are dragons on another planet. They're not invading anybody else's planet, but like they are alien dragons. So
I will also shout out to a book that my daughter has that is really awesome called Dragons Love Tacos. And it's all about how dragons really love tacos, but when they eat spicy salsa, it causes the fire to explode. So, that's
dangerous.
Some really good world building right there.
Yeah. Well, now I want dragons to eat tacos and to have armor, like Evangelion, but with dragons. I think that's the goal.
And tacos.
Liv Chadha points out that you write the best characters, Mike, which is true.
She writes really good characters too, and she wrote about power armor and mechs in a climate apocalypse. So
super awesome.
Rise of the Red Hand. Everyone buy it.
Yes, this is another book that you're going to buy tonight. So she asks, what is your secret and your process to fleshing out these fascinating fictional people?
Oh, so they don't come fully formed. So what happens is when I start with like a concept. So like with Light Years from Home, it was like kind of taking the ideas of, the different inspirations and then like building an outline towards it. But then knowing that I'm going to have siblings, like that's basically all I knew about them. They were going to be college age when the abduction happened, and then you're going to jump 15 to 20 years later. And they were all going to be like diametrically opposed in different ways. I didn't really figure out their voices. And this is what usually happens to me. Like my skeletal draft is mostly about like get the bones of the story down. And as I'm doing that, it's a bit of a discovery process. And then like the character will have a bit of dialogue. And I'm like, oh, that actually sounds like, who I think they should be. And I'll just kind of make note of it and try to start working that in. It's usually only about like the second or third pass through there where I'm like, I actually know who these characters are. I know how they're going to evolve. But one thing that I do is like, I kind of just assign quirks to them. And sometimes it's arbitrary and sometimes it's like purposeful. Like in this case, Cassie, I knew I wanted her to be able to communicate with her ex-husband across long distance. But I thought like, Skype or Zoom or whatever is like, it's really boring. And then my wife plays Elder Scrolls online like all the time. And I thought like, that'd be kind of fun because like she's got friends in her guild and stuff. I thought like that would be kind of neat, like if that was like her quirk. And then I thought, okay, once you assign that quirk, you have to kind of break it down to like, how do you make this realistic? And so for Cassie, like, oh, it makes sense because she's dealing with her mom's like deteriorating brain all day, and she's dealing with like the pressures of having like a day job as a therapist. So she's facing these external pressures all the time. So it makes sense that her escape is to go into like this fantasy video game world where none of that exists, and she could fight dragons maybe outside of power armor but dragons and demons and other stuff, and she could just exist in there without ever caring about like the things that are just destroying her real world. So I'll take like a quirk that I think is cool, but then I have to apply it to actually see if it actually works. There was a thing that Evie does where she takes a selfie as like to remember like a specific moment in her life. So she takes the picture, but she doesn't smile. It's not posed or anything. And that came from, I think someone on Twitter said something like, I took a selfie to capture the moment. And I thought that's a really cool thing to do, because like all of our photos like automatically upload. And so like you could capture like, a picture is worth 1,000 words. You could capture that in there. I'm like, that's a really neat character thing that like, there could be 1,000 reasons why someone starts doing that. Like it could just be like they found it efficient. But I just picked that and I stuck it in there and it worked for the character. So I think that's really where you start to round them out. Like once you find their voice, then you have to give them like these quirks, but they have to feel real to the character. A good example of this from popular movies is I think back to The Rock with Sean Connery and Nicolas Cage, and how Nicolas Cage's character just randomly loves the Beatles. And I remember reading at the time, like he suggested that idea. And they're like, yeah, that sounds great. And it gives him, like, it rounds him out a little bit more. And so, like, that's the kind of thing where I think, like, it's fun to do because it just makes them more real. We all have our, random quirks. I mean, this book was inspired by a song that I liked when I was a teen and I still love. And so it's like, if you wrote the fictional character of me, it'd be like indie rock nerd fan, we all have those types of traits.
Mm-hmm. So it's like both the bigger things, like maybe what has traumatized someone, but also like it's really important to have these little bits of
it,
like,
really humanizes
quirks.
them.
Yeah.
And then like you can play off like the little quirks, you can play it off with as they go through like the bigger things that like polarize them from the other characters. It's like they can push more into this extreme or like bring it out at a particular moment. And I find that it's always emotionally satisfying when you see one of these quirks like at the beginning of their journey and then how it's slightly changed at the end of their journey.
I love that. That's so cool. Okay. So here is another Star Wars question from Mike Westfall, who asks, does everything that you wrote become canon?
Until they decide it's not.
Yeah. Remember when they were just like, oh, the entire extended universe is not canon anymore?
The way that it works is like the books since Chuck Wendig's Aftermath trilogy, every book that comes out is considered canon. So until they decide to overwrite it with a line of dialogue in a TV show or something, it's canon.
Kan Wong asks a question that I also would like to know. He says, your books to date have been standalones. So do you have any thoughts about writing a series, or perhaps all your books are actually in the same universe?
I don't think that would work.
Yes, it would.
I'm sure there's a way to do that. The only one that I have purposefully left groundwork for a potential sequel is We Could Be Heroes. And I thought a beginning at the end, like the world is big enough that if I wanted to revisit it, like there's plenty of material out there, but there's no intention of it.
Mm-hmm.
Here and Now and Then, I've been asked about that one because that's kind of the one that's the most well known. And my reply is always, that family has been through way too much. And if I gave them another adventure, that would be really, really cruel to do. So like, I just want to leave them as is. I don't like the idea of writing a series because it feels like you have to do a lot of world building for that.
I see.
Like, I'm totally serious. It's like you need to come up with something that like progressively, gets bigger and twists and things like that. And with We Could Be Heroes, I had originally written it purely as like a standalone. And then during the last pass with my editor, she said, like, this is kind of like playing off comic book tropes. So you have to include hints of like what's happening in other cities. Do other people with, these extraordinary powers, like, do they exist? What's the gossip behind them? So in theory, like, I have some ideas where like the story could go if I wanted to revisit it, and if my publisher wanted to revisit it, but it was not written with like intention of like first of a trilogy. Like that just seems really hard.
Yeah. I mean, I guess you could do like well, anyway, I'm not going to tell you what to write. That's fine.
You can, you're smarter than me.
So Christina Powers would like to know what you're currently reading.
I am reading, because I've been reading to my daughter a lot because I don't have time to read like my own, like for fun stuff. But the Bunnicula series by James Howe, which like hopefully people remember from their childhood, it is ridiculously good. It's well written. Like the prose is actually very adult. It's funny as hell. And so if you don't know Bunnicula, it's about this rabbit that the family suspects is a vampire because it drains. They think it drains vegetables of its juice. And it's from the point of view of the dog in the family. And the dog is like Scully and the cat is like Mulder. It's like the cat is just like this total conspiracy theorist and like reads a lot and like gets all these ideas of like, I mean, there's a scene in the first Bunnicula book where like he reads that he has to stake the heart of the bunny. So he grabs some steak from the refrigerator and throws it at the bunny. It's so funny. So I've been reading that. with my daughter and enjoying it like on an adult level. The last book that I was able to read for fun was called Meet Me in Another Life by Catriona Sylvie. And if you like my books, you will love this book. I messaged Catriona like right when I finished it. I put like, I'm so jealous I didn't write this. It's about these two people who they keep it's not a time loop, but they keep re-meeting each other. So like they keep dying and then growing up and like living and then meeting each other again, but in different circumstances, like different jobs, different like sexualities, different ages, and they're not sure why. When they can finally start to recall like this loop that they've been in, then they start to like try to piece together why and how it's happening. And the prose is better than the prose that I could write. The characters are awesome. The feelings are major feelings. So if you like my books, please check it out. It's so good. It's called Meet Me in Another Life.
That sounds great. I'm curious. I mean, as someone who follows you on social media, because I'm such a fan, I know that you talk about hanging out with your daughter a lot, and I know that you spend a lot of time with her with homeschooling and stuff. Do you ever talk to her about your stories? Like, does she inspire anything that you're working on, or?
She, it's funny because like she just realized maybe about like a year ago that like the books on the shelves are mine, but she said they look boring.
Well, there's no pictures in them, Mike.
Yeah, there's no pictures in them. But I will say that for the Star Wars book, one of the supporting characters, I let her pick the species for it. And
Nice.
I named it like kind of, you know how Star Wars names are just kind of like chopped up human names. So it's named after her, and her best friend is also in there too. So
oh, that's awesome. So she understands you're writing a Star Wars book.
I actually haven't told her yet. I'm going to wait until we were originally going to wait for the cover, but then we were thinking like maybe just waiting to actually get a physical copy. Like she does listen to some of the Star Wars audiobooks with me. And she loves Star Wars. She watches Clone Wars. She will ask me questions about like Count Dooku while she's taking a shower and stuff. So like she's into like deep canon. And like I never should have told her like ask me your Star Wars questions. I can answer them. And I'm like I answer so many Star Wars questions now. But yeah, it's going to be really cool. Like, you know, I hope that she continues to be a geeky, you know, sci-fi fan, and that's something that like we'll be able to share and move forward with, and then she'll have a little like claim of her own.
Yeah, that's awesome. I remember when my nephew was quite young, like probably about the age of your daughter, and I got a box of my books from the publisher, and I opened it up and I'm like, these are my books. And he like looked at me, he's like, these are all the same. I was like, yeah, they sent me a bunch of copies.
You know, what she's helped me do, because like, you know, your publisher sends you like, I get 40 or 50 copies of each hardback, and I'm like, I don't know what to do with these. So I packed them in the car, and when we're driving to like the park or the tennis court or something, like I have her spot out little free libraries that she sees, and then I pull over and she'll help me put them in. So
that's
like
awesome.
So if you're in like the Palo Alto area, like check the little free libraries if you want free copies of my book.
Okay, we have, I think, time for one more question from the audience. Also, Evan from Booksmith notes that Booksmith sells adorable Bunnicula totes. So in case,
nice.
Yes. So FYI. So, okay, final question from Richard Donnelly. So do you have an ending when you start writing, or do your books evolve as you write? Do the characters come before the idea, or does the story come first?
So I'd say like the situation comes first. Like in this case, like, you know, alien abduction leads to family fracture. I have found that with all of my stories, there's some moment in like the latter part of Act 3 that I can visualize. That like like I know I want to build around that. Like in this book, it was the idea of them being back at the, well, shoot, no spoilers.
Yeah, don't tell that. I know what scene you were about to talk about. No.
Yeah.
But you knew there was a scene.
Yeah. With each of them, like with We Could Be Heroes, like, okay, no more spoilers. There's a scene of it's usually like the dialogue, or at least the emotional beat arrives in my head, and I know the circumstances that I want to, it's like seeing it visually. So I know that I am writing towards that point. And it may not be the very end, but it's going to be some sort of emotional resolution. So that's always in my head as I'm doing the first draft. And I usually find when I get there, that scene is like the easiest to write because I've already seen it in my head. And that allows me to kind of like trickle down and then start filling in the gaps from earlier. So
Nice.
I do things very out of order.
Mm-hmm. I think that's true of a lot of writers. So the other piece of that question was just, do you come up with characters first or the story first?
So again, it's a little bit of both. Like I'll go to We Could Be Heroes. Like I knew that I wanted the supervillain to be like a really nice nerdy guy in real life, and I wanted the superhero to be like a disaster person in real life, because the whole idea with that book is about playing to like opposites and against type. In this case, because I had these 3 siblings who are all have like a sibling rivalry with each other, every time I assigned something to like Evie, I knew like that's going to be opposite of what Cass does, like in terms of like their family history. And then like Jacob is kind of like the like whatever, it doesn't matter to me. So it was like taking that attitude and then processing it through like their family history. So it was like as I built one, it trickled down into the others.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for chatting with us today. Thanks to everyone for coming out and buying tons of books. And this is just such a wonderful book. I mean, anyway, you should buy all of Mike's books, obviously. But this is just, anyway, awesome accomplishment.
You should read Annalee's books too, especially The Future of Another Timeline, because you want to see the band in there wind up in my vampire book on stage at the Fillmore.
So yeah, because if you're looking for that sequel feeling, Future of Another Timeline and then Vampire Weekend. Yeah.
It's a crossover universe.
Exactly. Crossover event.
Oh, thank you both so much. And Mike, congratulations on the book. Annalee, this has been wonderful. Thank you for leading the conversation as always. And everybody who's tuned in, I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did and that you already have all of the copies. But if you don't, click through and get signed books from Mike, get Annalee's books, get them from Booksmith and do it now.
And Banicula totes.
Yeah, and get a Banicula tote. Make your year. Thank you all so much. Take care and hope to see you all soon.
Bye.
Bye.